The discovery that Arizona desert stretched endlessly under the pre-dawn darkness, its silence broken only by the distant howl of coyotes and the gentle hum of wind through Joshua trees. Samuel Rivers sat on his back porch, ceramic coffee mug warming his weathered hands as he watched the eastern horizon for the first hints of sunrise. At 68, Sam had developed a routine as predictable as the desert sunrise itself. Wake at 5, coffee on the porch, then a slow walk round his 20-acre property to check on his solar panels and weather monitoring equipment. 3 years had passed since Martha's funeral. 3 years since he'd sold their suburban Phoenix home and bought this isolated ranch house 40 miles outside Tucson. The realtor had warned him about the loneliness, the harsh summers, the complete lack of neighbors for miles in any direction. Sam had smiled and signed the papers anyway. Sometimes a man needed space to breathe, space to remember, space to heal. The morning ritual continued as Sam finished his coffee and pulled on his hiking boots. His daily inspection walk covered roughly 2 miles, following a path he'd worn into the desert floor through countless mornings just like this one. The route took him past his small workshop, around the solar array that powered his modest needs, and out to the rocky outcropping where he'd installed his telescope platform. Martha had always teased him about his love for astronomy, calling him her stargazer with that gentle smile that still haunted his dreams. As Sam rounded the familiar bend near the old dried riverbed, something caught his eye. The sand patterns looked different, disturbed in a way that natural wind couldn't explain. Long furrows stretched across the desert floor, as if something heavy had skidded to a stop after falling from a great height. Sam paused, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses to get a better look. In his 40-year career at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, he'd seen plenty of crash sites, though usually they involved billion-dollar satellites and very angry congressmen. Following the disturbed sand trail, Sam walked roughly 300 yards before he found the source. Half buried in a natural depression between 2 large boulders sat something that definitely didn't belong in the Arizona desert. The object measured approximately 15 feet long and 8 feet wide, with a hull that seemed to shift color as the growing daylight hit it from different angles. Its surface was smooth, almost organic-looking, like it had been grown rather than built. Sam approached slowly, his engineer's mind automatically cataloging details. No visible seams or welds, no recognizable propulsion system. The whole material reflected light in ways that suggested properties beyond anything in his considerable materials, science, knowledge. As he circled the object, he noticed what appeared to be a viewing port near the front. Though it was dark and difficult to see through, a soft sound from inside the craft made Sam freeze. It wasn't mechanical, wasn't the kind of settling noise that damaged equipment might make. It sounded almost like breathing, but with an odd rhythm that seemed somehow wrong for human lungs. Sam leaned closer to the viewing port, shading his eyes against the morning glare. Inside, he could make out a figure slumped in what looked like a pilot's seat. The being was roughly humanoid in shape, but clearly not human. Its skin had a pale blue-gray tint, and its proportions were slightly off, limbs a bit too long, torso a bit too narrow. Most startling were the injuries. Dark fluid that might have been blood had dried on the being's face and hands, and its breathing came in shallow, labored gasps. Any reasonable person would have run, would have called the authorities, or at least spent several minutes questioning their own sanity. Sam Rivers had spent 4 decades working on projects that pushed the boundaries of human knowledge, had seen technologies that seemed impossible become routine, had watched humanity take its first steps toward becoming a spacefaring species. He was also a man who had held his dying wife's hand in a hospital room and promised her he would keep helping people however he could. Sam walked around the craft until he found what appeared to be an access panel. The surface was smooth and featureless, but when he placed his palm against it, the material seemed to sense his presence. A section of the hull became transparent, then gradually dissolved into an opening large enough for him to climb through. The interior of the craft was smaller than its external dimensions suggested, with most of the space occupied by systems Sam couldn't begin to identify. The pilot, for lack of a better term, was definitely alive but clearly in distress. Up close, Sam could see that the being's injuries included what looked like burns on its hands and a deep cut across its forehead that was still seeping that dark fluid. The alien's eyes opened as Sam approached, revealing irises that shifted between violet and gold. For a moment, both beings simply stared at each other across the vast gulf of species and space. Then the alien attempted to sit up, winced in pain, and gestured weakly toward something on the control panel. Sam followed the gesture and saw what appeared to be a communication device, though it was unlike anything in his experience. When he looked back at the alien, it nodded and pointed to itself, then to the device, then to Sam. The meaning seemed clear enough. It wanted to try to communicate. Moving slowly to avoid startling the injured being, Sam carefully lifted the device. It was warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with its own internal light. The moment his fingers made contact, images flashed through his mind. Not words, but concepts and emotions. Fear, pain, urgency, and underneath it all, a desperate need. For help, the alien raised one long-fingered hand and placed it over its chest, then pointed to Sam and repeated the gesture. The universal language of introduction, Sam realized. He did the same, patting his own chest and then pointing to the alien. Sam, he said clearly, pointing to himself. Then, pointing to the alien, he raised his eyebrows in the universal question. Mark of inquiry. The alien's mouth moved, producing sounds like wind chimes mixed with flowing water. After a moment, it seemed to understand that Sam couldn't reproduce those sounds. Instead, it reached toward the communication device again. And another image flashed in Sam's mind. This time he saw symbols, geometric patterns that somehow conveyed the concept of exploration, of peaceful intentions, of a being who had traveled far from home. Sam nodded to show he understood, then pointed to the alien's injuries and made a gesture toward the exit. The being hesitated, clearly afraid, but his condition was deteriorating. Sam could see that whatever served as its circulatory system was losing fluid at an alarming rate. "I'm going to help you," Sam said, speaking slowly and clearly, even though he knew the alien couldn't understand his words. "But I need to get some supplies from my house. I'll be back in 10 minutes. He held up both hands, then closed and opened them once to indicate 10. The alien nodded weakly, apparently understanding the numerical concept. Sam climbed out of the craft and jogged back toward his house, his mind racing. He'd just had first contact with an extraterrestrial being, and his biggest concern was making sure it didn't bleed to death in his backyard. Martha would have laughed at his priorities, but she also would have been proud. In 40 years of marriage, she'd never known him to walk away from someone who needed help. First contact. Sam returned to the crash site carrying his largest first aid kit, a thermos of water, and a toolkit that had served him well through decades of fixing broken equipment. The alien was still conscious, but barely, its breathing more labored than before. The dark fluid on its injuries had continued to seep, and Sam could see that time was running short. He climbed back into the craft and knelt beside the pilot's chair, opening his first aid kit with practiced efficiency. The alien watched him, warily, but didn't resist when Sam began cleaning the wound on its forehead with antiseptic wipes. The fluid was thicker than human blood and had an odd, metallic smell, but it responded to pressure and basic wound care just like any injury Sam had ever treated. As he worked, Sam talked quietly, his voice calm and reassuring. "That's a nasty cut you've got there, friend. Looks like you hit something hard during your landing. But the good news is, it's not as deep as it looked. Head wounds always bleed more than they should." The alien tilted its head slightly, apparently responding to Sam's tone even if it couldn't understand the words. When Sam held up the water thermos and pantomimed drinking, the being nodded eagerly. He helped support its head while it drank, noting that its mouth and throat seemed designed for liquids. Another point of similarity between their species. After addressing the most serious injuries, Sam sat back and really looked at his patient. The being was roughly 5.5 feet tall, with a build that suggested both strength and grace. Its skin had that blue-gray tint he'd noticed before, but now he could see it was actually quite beautiful, with subtle patterns that seemed to shift in the light. The hands were particularly elegant, with long, tapering fingers that ended in what might have been very small claws or just unusual fingernails. The alien reached again for the communication device, this time with more strength. When Sam touched it, the images that flowed between them were clearer and more complex. He saw a star system with multiple planets, spacecraft that moved between worlds like ships crossing an ocean, and most importantly, the concept of exploration and peaceful contact. The being was showing him that it was a scout, an advanced representative of its people who had come to Earth not to conquer but to learn. Sam nodded to show he understood, then tried to project his own thoughts through the device. Images of Earth, of humanity, of the space program he'd devoted his career to building. The alien's eyes widened as it realized that Sam wasn't just a random human who had stumbled across the crash site. He was someone who understood space travel, who had spent his life working toward the moment when humanity might reach for the stars. The communication became easier as they continued to use the device. Sam learned that the alien's name was something like Zara, though the actual sounds were impossible for him to pronounce. She, for the mental images suggested feminine characteristics, had been conducting long-range reconnaissance when her scout ship suffered a critical system failure during atmospheric entry. The crash landing had damaged her ship's main. Systems had injured her badly enough that she couldn't complete necessary repairs alone. Sam examined the spacecraft's control systems with the methodical approach that had made him one of NASA's most trusted engineers. The technology was far beyond anything humans had developed, but the basic principles were surprisingly familiar. Energy flowed through conduits, information moved through processing networks, and propulsion was generated through the manipulation of fundamental forces. It was like looking at a master craftsman's work when you were still an apprentice. But the underlying logic was recognizable. Zara guided him through the ship's systems, using a combination of the communication device and careful gestures. The main power coupling had been severed during the crash, and several critical components had been damaged by the violent landing. With human technology, the ship would have been a total loss. But Sam had spent 40 years learning that impossible problems often had surprisingly simple solutions if you approached them from the right angle. He returned to his workshop and gathered every tool and component that might be useful. Wire, solder, small electronic parts, even some rare earth magnets he'd been saving for a telescope upgrade project. When he returned to the crash site, Zara had managed to activate some kind of emergency lighting system that made the interior much easier to see. Working together, they began the delicate process of repairing the damaged systems. Sam's hands did the actual work, but Zara guided every step through mental images and careful demonstrations. The alien technology seemed to respond to intent as much as physical manipulation, requiring a kind of intuitive understanding that Sam found both challenging and exhilarating as they worked. Sam found himself thinking about the broader implications of what was happening. First contact with an alien species right here in his backyard. The scientific community would lose their collective minds. Governments would want to study, analyze, and probably weaponize whatever they could learn. And somewhere in the mix, Zara would be treated like a specimen rather than a person. The thought made him uncomfortable. In the hours they'd spent together, Sam had come to see Zara as an individual with her own fears, hopes, and personality. She was intelligent, curious, and despite being stranded on an alien world, she had shown remarkable courage and determination. The idea of her being locked away in some government facility while bureaucrats and generals decided her fate was intolerable. As the sun climbed higher in the desert sky, Sam became aware of a new problem. Sound carried far in the open desert, and the distinctive wop-wop of helicopter rotors was growing closer. Military aircraft, from the sound of them, and probably heading in their direction. Someone had noticed Zara's atmospheric entry, and now they were conducting search operations. Sam looked at Zara, who had obviously heard the helicopters as well. Her expression showed the universal emotion of fear, and Sam realized that she understood the implications just as clearly as he did. If the military found the crash site, her fate would be sealed. "We need to hide you," Sam said, speaking quickly even though he knew she couldn't understand all the words. He pointed to the approaching sound, then made hiding gestures, then pointed toward his house. Zara nodded immediately. Despite her injuries, she began shutting down the ship's systems with swift, practiced movements. The hull sealed itself as soon as they were both outside, and within moments the craft looked like nothing more than an oddly shaped boulder, half buried in the sand. Sam helped Zara walk the 300 yards back to his house, supporting her. Wait when her injured leg threatened to give out. The helicopters were getting closer, their search pattern systematic and thorough. Sam estimated they had maybe 10 minutes before the aircraft reached his property. He got Zara settled in his back bedroom, the one that had been Martha's craft room and still smelled faintly of the lavender sachets she'd loved. Zara looked around the room with obvious curiosity, her gaze lingering on the family photos and Martha's unfinished quilting projects. When she looked at Sam with what he interpreted as a questioning expression, he pointed to a picture of Martha and himself taken on their 40th wedding anniversary. "My wife," he said simply. "She died 3 years ago." Zara didn't need the communication device to understand the sadness in his voice. She placed one long-fingered hand gently on his arm and made a soft sound that somehow conveyed sympathy across the species barrier. The helicopters arrived just as Sam finished closing the bedroom curtains. He walked out to his front porch and waited, a cup of coffee in his hands and the picture of a retired man enjoying his morning routine. When the military personnel landed and approached his property, Sam was ready for them. The encounter that followed would test every skill Sam had learned in 40 years of dealing with government bureaucracy, military officials, and the occasional reporter who got too curious about classified projects. But as he watched the soldiers approach his house, Sam felt a calm determination settle over him. Zara had trusted him with her life, and he wasn't going to let her down. The future of two species might very well depend on what happened in the next few hours, and Sam Rivers was exactly where he needed to be.